Robert E. Lee Biography. Robert E. Lee was the leading Confederate general during the U.S. Civil War and has been venerated as a heroic figure in the American South. Synopsis. Born in 1807 in Virginia, Robert E. Lee came to military prominence during the U.S. Civil War, commanding his home state's armed forces and becoming General-in-Chief of the Confederate forces toward the end of the conflict. Though the Union won the war, Lee earned renown as a military tactician for scoring several major victories on the battlefield. He went on to become president of Washington College, which was renamed Washington and Lee University after his death in 1870. Early years. Confederate general who led Southern forces against the Union Army in the American Civil War, Robert Edward Lee was born January 19, 1807, at his family home of Stratford Hall in northeastern Virginia. Lee was cut from Virginia aristocracy. His extended family members included a president, a Chief Justice of the United States and signers of the Declaration of Independence. His father, Colonel Henry Lee, also known as Light Horse Harry, had served as a cavalry leader during the Revolutionary War and earned recognition as one of the war's heroes, winning praise from General George Washington. Lee saw himself as an extension of his family's greatness. At 18, he enrolled at West Point Military Academy, where he put his drive and serious mind to work. He placed second in his graduating class after 4 spotless years without a demerit, and wrapped up his studies with perfect scores in artillery, infantry, and cavalry. After graduating from West Point, Lee in 1831 married Mary Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, from her first marriage, prior to meeting George Washington. Together, they had 7 children, 3 sons, Custis, Rooney, and Rob, and 4 daughters, Mary, Annie, Agnes, and Mildred. Early military career. While Mary and the children spent their lives on Mary's father's plantation, Lee stayed committed to his military obligations. His loyalties moved him around the country, from Savannah to St. Louis to New York. In 1846, Lee got the chance he'd been waiting his whole military career for when the United States went to war with Mexico. Serving under General Winfield Scott, Lee distinguished himself as a brave battle commander and brilliant tactician. In the aftermath of the U.S. victory over its neighbor, Lee was held up as a hero. Scott showered Lee with particular praise, saying that in the event the U.S. went into another war, the government should consider taking out a life insurance policy on the commander. But life away from the battlefield proved difficult for Lee to handle. He struggled with the mundane tasks associated with his work and life. For a time, he returned to his wife's family's plantation to manage the estate, following the death of his father-in-law. The property had fallen under hard times, and for 2 long years, he tried to make it profitable again. Confederate leader. In October 1859, Lee was summoned to put an end to a slave insurrection led by John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Lee's orchestrated attack took just a single hour to end the revolt, and his success put him on a short list of names to lead the Union Army should the nation go to war. But Lee's commitment to the Army was superseded by his commitment to Virginia. After turning down an offer from President Abraham Lincoln to command the Union forces, Lee resigned from the military and returned home. While Lee had misgivings about centering a war on the slavery issue, after Virginia voted to secede from the nation on April 17, 1861, Lee agreed to help lead the Confederate forces. Over the next year, Lee again distinguished himself on the battlefield. On June 1, 1862, he took control of the Army of Northern Virginia and drove back the Union Army during the 7 days battles near Richmond. In August of that year, he gave the Confederacy a crucial victory at Second Manassas. But not all went well. He courted disaster when he tried to cross the Potomac at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, barely escaping the site of the bloodiest single-day skirmish of the war, which left some 22,000 combatants dead. From July 1 to 3, 1863, Lee's forces suffered another round of heavy casualties in Pennsylvania. The 3-day standoff, known as the Battle of Gettysburg, wiped out a huge chunk of Lee's army. halting his invasion of the North while helping to turn the tide for the Union. By the fall of 1864, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had gained the upper hand, decimating much of Richmond, the Confederacy's capital, and Petersburg. By early 1865, the fate of the war was clear, a fact driven home on April 2 when Lee was forced to abandon Richmond. A week later, a reluctant and despondent Lee surrendered to Grant at a private home in Appomattox, Virginia. "I suppose there is nothing for me to do but go and see General Grant," he told an aide. "And I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Final years. Saved from being hanged as a traitor by a forgiving Lincoln and Grant, Lee returned to his family in April 1865. He eventually accepted a job as president of Washington College in Western Virginia, and devoted his efforts toward boosting the institution's enrollment and financial support. In late September 1870, Lee suffered a massive stroke. He died at his home, surrounded by family, on October 12. Shortly afterward, Washington College was renamed Washington and Lee University. To be black at Robert E. Lee High School. Ast Spring in Tyler, Texas, a small city 2 hours east of Dallas, an African-American couple had a series of agonizing conversations at their kitchen table at night, talking softly after their children were in bed. Their daughter, an oldest child, loved cheerleading in junior high. She was eager to try out for the squad at the local public high school, where she was set to enroll as a freshman in the fall. But the name of this particular school in Tyler, a community that some residents like to think of as the western edge of the Old South, ate away at her parents. We would ask ourselves, are we really gonna have our daughter running around a football field yelling, "I love Robert E. Lee," the mother told me. In the end, the couple decided to send their daughter to Robert E. Lee High School, where the student body is nearly 60% black and Latino. They considered a local private school, but it was expensive and farther away, and many of their daughter's friends were going to Lee. "This should be an exciting and happy time for a family," the mother, who asked to remain anonymous because she feared retaliation against her daughter, said. "No one should have to go to a school named for their oppressor." On a humid Monday evening last month, she was one of nearly 300 parents and residents who showed up for a school board meeting to join or rejoin a half-century-old fight in Tyler, what to do with Robert E. Lee High School. Those who support changing the name contend that the time is right, given the school's current demographics and the fact that it is being torn down and completely rebuilt in a $122 million renovation. Opponents say changing the name would erase history. As the meeting began, 3 uniformed police officers greeted attendees at the door, seeming to know about every third person who walked in. Some who attended carried handwritten speeches. The white supremacists in Charlottesville and what President Trump did and didn't say about them got tile rights talking about their own city's most radioactive Confederate symbol. But of the roughly 40 people who signed up and spoke for 2 minutes apiece at the meeting, not one uttered the word Trump, whether they were for or against changing the school's name. A few rattled off talking points lifted wholesale from Facebook, about creeping neoliberalism and the Marxist agenda and ISIS destroying statues, but those remarks didn't stir many in the crowd. Instead, jaws tightened when someone brought up how Robert E. Lee High School got its name in the first place. It opened as an all-white school, in 1958, 4 years after Brown v. Board of Education and just a few months after the state of Texas won a major victory against the NAACP in state court. More than one speaker cast the then all-white school board's choice of name as clear-cut retribution, a reminder of black folks' place in Tyler. Later, a white father of 3 said that his children, who graduated from Robert E. Lee 20 years ago, might as well use their diplomas as toilet paper if the school's name was taken away. Before the meeting started, Kevin Brawley, Robert E. Lee class of 1977, sat toward the back of the room chatting with his sister and cousin, who both went to Lee, too. Brawley is a beefy guy, white, with a shaved head under a baseball cap and a thick white beard. He's a proud alumnus, but he also remembers parts of his time at Lee as awful, just awful. He went to school there during an earlier iteration of the school's debate over heritage and hate. In 1970, a statewide federal desegregation order, issued by a district judge in Tyler, forced Lee to admit black students. The school also had to get rid of its Confederate-themed mascot, the Rebels, fight song, Dixie, and prized Confederate flag, so large that it required 20 boys to carry. Its beloved Rebel Guard, a squadron of boys handpicked by an American history teacher to dress in replica Confederate uniforms at football games and fire a cannon named Ole Spirit after touchdowns, had to find a new name. Same for the Rebellettes drill team. Immediately after his desegregation order, the judge and his wife became widely hated in town. She had to drive to the next county over to get her hair done. When Brawley started at Lee as a freshman, 5 years later, he remembers, fights were still breaking out between black and white students. And that was just over a mascot, he said. Imagine the fighting if they changed the whole name. Also attending the meeting was Karen Jeffrey Sanders, a fifth-generation black Tileright in her early 50s. Her parents and grandparents were alumni of another storied Tyler High School, Emmett J. Scott, once the city's powerhouse all-black school, named for a black educator and Renaissance man. Jeffrey Sanders grew up being sure that she'd go to Scott someday. It seemed that every grown-up she looked up to was a Scottie. The school had pumped out generations of Tyler's black lawyers, doctors, and civic leaders. Its teachers, including Jeffrey Sanders's parents, came from the best historically black colleges in the country. But, by the time she finished middle school, Scott was an asbestos-ridden empty shell. It was forced to close in 1970, a casualty of the same integration battle that took away Robert E. Lee's rebel flag. In a move that the black community in Tyler interpreted as payback, the nearly all-white school board chose to shut Scott down rather than integrate it. Jeffrey Sanders went to one of Tyler's formerly all-white high schools instead. At the school board meeting, several attendees kept track of how many speakers were for and against the name change. In the end, it was a draw, 18 for, 18 against. Jeffrey Sanders winced as some of the against white Tyler residents took their turns at the microphone, arguing emotionally about what they saw as erasing the past. I wanted to say to them, where were you when they erased Emmett J. Scott? Where were you when they erased my history? She told me. For Tylerites with old connections to both high schools, the new fight over the school's name feels like picking an old scab that never healed, the Reverend Michael Mast, a black minister in town, told me. Mast was the final speaker of the night. The superintendent's request for total silence during each person's comments had largely been followed by the crowd, but Mast sparked a response. He brought up the fact that black folks in Tyler were never invited to comment on the decision to not only get rid of the name Emmett J. Scott High School but to get rid of the whole school. The meeting room became church for a moment, as many of the black folks present nodded and shifted in their seats, and a murmur of agreement and appreciation rippled through the crowd. Last month's jam-packed school board meeting was, in fact, not the first such meeting held to debate what this school should be called. Nearly 50 years ago, and a year before the first mixed-race class entered Lee, a group of black activists asked the school board to change the school's name. Up to 600 people showed up at that meeting. More people stood outside, listening on a set of loudspeakers. After hearing from the activists' lawyer and reviewing a petition signed by 500 members of the black community, a white school board member moved that the name of Robert E. Lee High School remain unchanged for the present time. The minutes indicate that, at some point, half of the audience got up and left. The minutes don't say whether those who left were black or white. This time around, nearly everyone in the room stayed until the end. Of the citizens who spoke in favor of a new name, most were white. This school board today is more diverse. Of the 7-member board, 2 members are black and 1 is Hispanic. One of the black board members graduated with honors from the last ever class at Emmett J. Scott High School, the class of 1970. The grandmother of one of the white board members had given the giant Confederate flag that once flew over Robert E. Lee High School's football games. A second board meeting on this issue was held this week, and a slim majority of members seemed to favor renaming the school. The board president, a white Lee grad and a pastor in town, noted that Tyler has a long record, at seemingly every turn, of resisting efforts to integrate its schools. To those who say we should not forget our history, he said, I would say the history of 50 years ago is more important than the history of 150 years ago. Hardly any current students showed up at either meeting, but they have been debating the issue on Instagram and Snapchat. Several pointed out to me that their entire school is being torn down soon, as part of the renovation approved by Tyler voters this year. No one seems to be upset about that, Brandon Collins, 16, a black Lee Jr., told me. You say we can't change the name cause that would be erasing history, but you're happy that we're getting a whole new building. Ideas for a new name are being tossed around among the student body. There's Rose City High, Tyler is big on roses, Hamilton High, and Tyler Lee, the school's unofficial nickname, long popular with black families who want to avoid the real name. Mast, the black minister who elicited amens at the August school board meeting, says that the name has to change, and argues that there are only two good options. As a great compromise, the board could rename the school as a tribute to Dorothy Lee, a black Tyler community organizer who played a big role in the push, half a century ago, to clean out Confederate flags and symbols from Robert E. Lee High. She was a great lady, the Reverend told me. You couldn't go wrong with that. The Reverend's number one choice? Emmett J. Scott High School. That would be poetic justice, he said with a laugh, as his wife, Sandra, who was a sophomore at Scott when it closed, listened. How would white Tyler respond to that choice? Mast thought about it for a second. To be quite honest, he said, they would get over it and move on, just like we had to move on. Once it was decided, it was decided. What more could you say?